close your eyes for a moment and allow the world around you to grow a little quieter. Imagine that it is the year 1325. The last light of day has faded beyond the hills of medieval Europe, and only the gentle glow of a single tallow candle remains. Its small flame dances against walls of cold gray stone that have stood for generations, while somewhere in the distance, the slow toll of a monastery bell drifts across the evening air. You have arrived at a quiet convent, a place where time seems to move more slowly than anywhere else in the world. The gardens are still. The cloisters are silent. The scent of beeswax candles mingles with damp stone, fresh herbs, and the cool breath of the night. Every doorway, every corridor, and every shadow appears peaceful, almost untouched by the troubles of the outside world. To most people, these monasteries were places of perfect devotion. They imagined lives filled only with prayer, humble work, and peaceful reflection. They believed that behind these thick stone walls, nothing could disturb the calm. But history has a curious habit of whispering a different story. Hidden among faded letters, forgotten court records, and the careful writings of medieval chroniclers are accounts that surprised even the people who later discovered them. Some tell of ambition. Others speak of forbidden friendships, bitter rivalries, political struggles, and quiet scandals that unfolded far away from the eyes of ordinary villagers. Whether every story was true, exaggerated, or shaped by rumor is a question historians still explore today. Yet together, they reveal that even places built for silence were never entirely free from the complicated nature of human life. Tonight, we are not here to judge those who lived centuries ago. Instead, we will gently wander through the quiet corridors of medieval convents, listening to the echoes left behind in history itself. I'm Kushi, and this is Sleepy History. So settle comfortably beneath your blanket, let your breathing slow, and together, let's step through those ancient wooden doors and begin our peaceful journey into one of medieval Europe's most unexpected stories. Take a slow, comfortable breath, and let the worries of the modern world quietly drift away. Now, imagine that you are standing before the wooden gates of a medieval abbey, somewhere in the rolling countryside of Europe. The morning has not fully arrived. The sky is painted in soft shades of blue and silver, while a gentle mist rests over the gardens like a light blanket. As the heavy gates slowly open, you step inside. The air feels cool against your skin. Thick stone walls surround peaceful courtyards that have witnessed centuries of quiet mornings just like this one. Their rough surfaces hold the memory of countless winters, countless prayers, and countless footsteps that have long since faded into history. The gentle scent of warm beeswax candles drifts through narrow corridors. Mixed with it is the faint aroma of old parchment, damp stone, fresh herbs from the monastery garden, and the smoke of a nearby fireplace that has been burning since before dawn. Somewhere beyond the chapel, a church bell begins to ring. Its deep, steady sound rolls through the silent valley, one, then another. Each note lingers in the cool morning air before slowly disappearing into the distant hills. Outside, a soft rain begins to fall. Tiny drops tap gently against wooden shutters and stone rooftops. Water gathers along worn pathways before slipping quietly into the earth below. The rain is not fierce. It is patient, calm, and almost comforting, as though nature itself wishes to preserve the silence. Within the chapel, the monks have already gathered for their first prayers of the day. Their voices rise together in slow Latin chants, echoing softly beneath high stone ceilings. The ancient melodies drift through the abbey like gentle waves, filling every corridor with a sense of peace that seems untouched by time. Elsewhere, the nuns begin their own morning routine. Some quietly light fresh candles before small wooden altars. Others sweep the cloisters with handmade brooms, their movements slow and practiced after years of repetition. A few tend the herb garden, collecting rosemary, sage, lavender, and mint, while tiny birds greet the new day from nearby trees. No one speaks unless necessary. The silence itself feels almost sacred. Every sound becomes noticeable. The crackle of a candle flame, the rustle of woolen robes, the distant flutter of pigeons beneath the roof. and the steady rhythm of rain outside the monastery walls. From a distance, this seems like the perfect place to escape the troubles of the world. A place devoted entirely to prayer, discipline, and quiet reflection. A place where every day unfolds exactly like the one before it. But history rarely leaves any place completely untouched. Even here, beneath these peaceful stone arches and echoing bells, human hopes, fears, ambitions, and mistakes quietly found their way inside. Yet behind these peaceful walls, history quietly recorded stories few people expected. As the first light of morning slowly spreads across the monastery grounds, the day truly begins. The bells have already announced the arrival of dawn, and throughout the convent, every sister quietly rises from her narrow bed. There are no hurried footsteps, no lively conversations, and no comfortable mornings spent lingering beneath warm blankets. The rhythm of life here is measured not by personal desire, but by the sound of the church bell. To understand the stories that would later surround medieval convents, we must first understand why these women came here in the first place. Many people today imagine that every nun willingly chose a life devoted to God, leaving behind the outside world because of deep personal faith. While this certainly happened, the reality was often much more complicated. For some women, entering a convent was indeed a heartfelt calling. They wished to spend their lives in prayer, study, and service. Medieval Europe offered very few paths for women who desired independence without marriage, and the convent could provide education, purpose, and even a respected position within society. Yet not every young woman walked through these gates by choice. Across medieval Europe, powerful noble families often faced difficult decisions about inheritance. A wealthy lord might have several daughters, but providing each with a generous marriage dowry could place enormous strain on the family's wealth. Sending one daughter to a convent often solved several problems at once. Without a marriage, there was no costly dowry to negotiate. Family land remained secure, political alliances became easier to manage, and the daughter could still enjoy a respectable life within the church. Some noble girls entered convents while they were still children, sometimes no older than 7 or 8 years of age. They learned to read prayers before they fully understood the promises they would one day make. As they grew older, many accepted this life with quiet grace. Others wondered what might have been waiting beyond the monastery walls. For girls born into poor farming families, the story could be very different. Life outside the convent was uncertain. Harvests could fail. Illness could spread quickly through villages. Famine and war often arrived without warning. For these families, a convent could offer something precious: regular meals, a warm place to sleep, protection from violence. The chance to learn skills that few ordinary women ever had the opportunity to study. Some convents taught reading and writing, particularly Latin prayers. Others trained women in music, herbal medicine, embroidery, manuscript decoration, or caring for the sick. In a world where education was rare, these opportunities could shape an entire lifetime. Yet even then, choice remained a complicated thing. Parents, relatives, bishops, and local rulers all influenced these decisions. Some girls embraced convent life, some accepted it, and some quietly wished for another future. Once a woman officially became a nun, her daily life followed an orderly rhythm that changed very little from season to season. Long before sunrise, the first bell echoed through the corridors. The sisters rose from simple wooden beds covered with straw-filled mattresses. Heavy wool blankets offered little comfort during the freezing winters, when frost sometimes formed inside the stone buildings themselves. The cold was impossible to ignore. Stone walls held the chill of the night, and small fireplaces rarely warmed every room. During especially harsh winters, many sisters slept wearing several layers of rough wool clothing beneath their habits simply to endure the darkness until morning. There were no soft pillows, no heated rooms, no thick mattresses. Comfort was never the purpose of monastic life. The first prayers began while the world outside remained almost completely dark. Candles flickered gently as voices blended together in ancient hymns that had been sung for generations. These prayers were not hurried. Each word was spoken carefully. Each pause invited reflection. The rhythm itself became part of daily life, as natural as breathing. Between prayers came work. Unlike the popular image of nuns spending every hour inside a chapel, convent life required constant labor. Some sisters baked bread before sunrise. Others milked goats or cared for chickens. Many worked in herb gardens, growing lavender, sage, rosemary, mint, and countless medicinal plants used to treat illness. Inside quiet workrooms, skilled hands copied manuscripts onto parchment using delicate goose feather quills. Every letter required patience. Every page demanded concentration. A single beautifully decorated manuscript could take months, sometimes years, to complete. Others embroidered church garments with astonishing detail. Tiny golden threads, colorful silks, and intricate patterns transformed simple cloth into works of extraordinary craftsmanship. These creations still survive in museums today, reminding us of the remarkable skill hidden behind convent walls. Silence played an important role throughout the day. Not every convent required complete silence at all times, but unnecessary conversation was often discouraged. Meals were usually eaten quietly. Sometimes one sister would stand before the others and read passages from religious texts while everyone else listened in silence. Imagine an entire dining hall filled with dozens of people. No laughter, no casual conversation. Only the sound of wooden spoons touching bowls and a calm voice reading sacred words. To modern ears, such silence might seem uncomfortable. To many medieval nuns, it became familiar, even peaceful. Food itself was simple. Breakfast, if served at all, might consist of coarse bread and watered ale or weak beer, which was often safer to drink than untreated water. Later meals commonly included vegetable soup, beans, onions, cabbage, peas, porridge, and dark rye bread. Cheese appeared when available. Fish was common on fasting days. Fresh fruit depended entirely upon the season. Meat was far less common than many people imagine. Strict religious calendars required frequent fasting, and many convents observed these traditions with remarkable discipline. No one expected luxurious feasts. Meals existed to sustain the body, not entertain it. After eating, work resumed. Some sisters cared for travelers seeking shelter. Others treated sick villagers using herbal remedies carefully prepared inside monastery gardens. Many convents became respected centers of healing, preserving medical knowledge passed from generation to generation. The afternoon brought more prayers, more work, more silence. As daylight slowly faded, candles once again illuminated the stone corridors. Evening prayers marked the approaching end of another carefully ordered day. Finally came sleep. The sleeping quarters were often large shared rooms rather than private bedrooms. Rows of simple wooden beds stretched quietly beneath heavy timber roofs. The air remained cold for much of the year. Blankets were rough, mattresses thin, privacy almost non-existent. The darkness was broken only by the occasional glow of a candle carried by the night watch. Outside, rain might gently strike the roof. Wind whispered through tiny window openings. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the night. Morning would arrive all too soon. For many women, this routine brought comfort. Its predictability offered peace in an uncertain medieval world. Each day resembled the last. Each season followed familiar rhythms: prayer, work, silence, rest, again and again. To those living beyond the convent walls, such a life often appeared almost perfect, a quiet refuge untouched by greed, ambition, or conflict. The stone walls seemed to protect not only the sisters inside, but also the ideals they represented. Yet appearances can sometimes be deceiving. Because as historians began carefully studying forgotten letters, bishops' reports, legal records, and centuries-old chronicles, they discovered that not every convent remained as peaceful as it first appeared. And behind those calm stone walls, another story was waiting to unfold. But not every convent followed these peaceful ideals. For a time, life inside many convents followed a quiet and predictable rhythm. The bells rang at the same hours each day. Prayers echoed through the chapel. Gardens were carefully tended, manuscripts patiently copied, and meals shared in respectful silence. But as we continue our journey through medieval Europe, the peaceful picture begins to change ever so slightly. not because every convent abandoned its purpose, but because some became something much larger than simple places of worship. As the centuries passed, certain convents grew remarkably wealthy. Kings, queens, noble families, and prosperous merchants often donated land, vineyards, forests, mills, and even entire villages to religious communities. These gifts were believed to bring spiritual blessings for the donor or their family. Over time, some convents owned thousands of acres of farmland. They collected rents from tenants. They harvested grain from their fields. They sold wool, wine, honey, cheese, herbs, and beautifully crafted textiles. The quiet monastery that once relied upon simple charity could gradually become one of the richest landowners in an entire region. With wealth came responsibility. But wealth also brought temptation. Imagine arriving at a convent surrounded not by a few modest gardens, but by carefully managed estates stretching toward the horizon. Workers tended vineyards. Farmers paid annual rents. Craftsmen maintained buildings. Servants delivered supplies. Visitors arrived carrying messages from distant castles. The abbey had become far more than a peaceful retreat. It had become an institution with economic power. Naturally, powerful people became interested. Noble families understood that influence inside the church could be just as valuable as influence inside a royal court. Rather than allowing important religious positions to be decided purely by devotion or experience, some families quietly encouraged their own daughters or relatives to become leaders within wealthy convents. In certain places, becoming an abbess meant overseeing large estates, managing finances, settling disputes, supervising dozens, or even hundreds of residents, and maintaining relationships with bishops, nobles, and even kings. This was no small responsibility. A capable abbess needed intelligence, diplomacy, organization, and remarkable patience. Many women fulfilled these duties with wisdom and honesty. Historical records praise abbesses who expanded hospitals, improved education, protected the poor, and preserved priceless manuscripts that still survive today. Yet history also reminds us that not every leader resisted the influence of power. As wealth increased, disagreements sometimes followed. Questions arose. Who controlled valuable lands? Who received donations? Who appointed new officials? Who answered to the local bishop? And perhaps most importantly, who truly held authority? In some regions, abbesses became surprisingly influential figures. They negotiated directly with noble families. They signed legal agreements. They managed taxes collected from monastery lands. Some even exercised authority normally reserved for powerful secular lords. For medieval society, this was extraordinary. Within convent walls, certain women possessed responsibilities that many women outside could never have imagined. But wherever authority exists, disagreements often appear. Documents preserved in church archives describe disputes over money, property boundaries, inheritance rights, and leadership elections. Not every disagreement became a scandal. Many were ordinary legal matters. Others, however, slowly damaged the peaceful reputation of certain communities. At the same time, discipline inside some wealthy convents began to change. The original monastic rules had emphasized simplicity, plain clothing, simple meals, limited possessions, regular prayer, quiet reflection. Yet visitors occasionally reported seeing something rather different. Certain convents possessed beautifully decorated dining halls, fine furniture, imported fabrics, silver tableware, generous feasts during important celebrations. Comfort itself was not necessarily forbidden. Many prosperous monasteries simply reflected the generosity of wealthy patrons. Still, some church reformers quietly wondered whether luxury had begun replacing humility. Letters written by bishops occasionally expressed concern. They encouraged stricter observance of traditional rules, more prayer, less extravagance, greater simplicity. Sometimes these recommendations were warmly accepted. Sometimes they were politely ignored. Human nature has changed remarkably little over the centuries. When communities become prosperous, maintaining discipline often becomes more difficult. One generation establishes careful traditions. The next becomes accustomed to comfort. The generation after that may hardly notice the difference. This gradual change happened so slowly that many people living within the convent probably never realized how much daily life had evolved. Another important change involved visitors. Modern readers often imagine medieval convents as completely isolated from the outside world. In reality, absolute isolation was rarely possible. Builders repaired damaged roofs, doctors treated illnesses, merchants delivered food, cloth, candles, ink, parchment, and tools. Priests celebrated, mass messengers carried official correspondence. Pilgrims occasionally requested shelter. Noble families came to visit daughters or relatives. Lawyers handled property matters. Farmers paid rents. Workers maintained gardens and fields. The monastery gates opened more often than many people imagine. Rules usually governed these visits carefully. Certain areas remained strictly private. Meetings were supervised. Conversations were limited. Yet perfect separation between the convent and the outside world proved difficult to maintain. Some bishops worried that boundaries were becoming less strict than intended. Official inspection reports from different parts of medieval Europe occasionally mention unauthorized conversations, excessive social gatherings, or visitors remaining longer than regulations permitted. It is important to remember that these reports do not describe every convent. Thousands of religious communities quietly continued their ordinary lives without attracting any criticism at all. History naturally preserves unusual events more readily than peaceful routine. A quiet year rarely fills the pages of a chronicle. A disagreement, however, a legal dispute, or an unexpected scandal, those are remembered. As evening settles over our imaginary abbey, candles once again flicker beneath high stone ceilings. Rain taps softly against ancient windows. The sisters prepare for another night of rest. Everything appears calm. Everything appears orderly. Yet somewhere beyond the monastery gate, another traveler approaches, perhaps carrying supplies, perhaps delivering a letter, perhaps seeking shelter for a single evening. Most visitors came and went without changing history. But a handful would leave behind stories copied into church records for centuries afterward. And according to those records, some visitors never truly left. As night settles more deeply over the convent, the halls become quieter still. The last prayers have been spoken. Candles burn with a soft, steady glow. Beyond the thick stone walls, the wind moves gently through the trees, while somewhere in the distance, an owl calls into the darkness. From the outside, everything appears exactly as it should, peaceful, orderly, unchanging. Yet history often reminds us that even the quietest places were inhabited by ordinary human beings, carrying ordinary emotions: hope, loneliness, friendship, regret, affection. These feelings did not disappear simply because someone entered a convent. For centuries, historians have searched through bishops' reports, monastery records, legal proceedings, private correspondence, and royal archives. Hidden among thousands of routine documents are occasional stories that reveal lives far more complicated than people once imagined. It is important to remember that these cases were unusual. If every convent had been filled with scandal, church officials would hardly have bothered recording individual investigations. The fact that these events were carefully documented often tells us that they were exceptions rather than everyday life. Still, they happened. And because medieval officials recorded them so carefully, their stories have survived across hundreds of years. Imagine a bishop arriving unexpectedly at a convent. His visit is not ceremonial. It is an official inspection. The gates open. Senior sisters greet him with respectful bows. Documents are prepared. Questions are asked. Rooms are examined. Sometimes everything proceeds peacefully. The bishop offers blessings before continuing his journey. But occasionally, whispers have reached his ears before he ever arrives. Rumors, complaints, anonymous accusations. Perhaps a local villager noticed unfamiliar visitors entering the convent after sunset. Perhaps another nun quietly reported unusual behavior. Perhaps disagreements inside the community had finally reached church authorities. The bishop's task was to discover whether those rumors reflected truth, misunderstanding, or simple gossip. Surviving records reveal fascinating glimpses into these investigations. Witnesses gave testimony. Servants answered questions. Letters were examined. Sometimes the accusations proved completely false. Sometimes they revealed only small violations of monastery rules. And sometimes investigators uncovered stories that no one expected. Among the most remarkable discoveries preserved in medieval archives are personal letters. Unlike official church documents, these letters feel surprisingly human. Their handwriting varies. Some are elegant, others rushed and uneven. Many speak of friendship, loneliness, spiritual encouragement, or family concerns. A very small number, however, suggest emotions that extended beyond ordinary companionship. Historians must approach such documents carefully. Language changed over the centuries. Expressions of affection between close friends often sound surprisingly romantic to modern readers, even when no romantic relationship existed. A phrase that appears intimate today may have been perfectly ordinary 800 years ago. For this reason, scholars rarely jump to dramatic conclusions. Instead, they compare letters with legal records, witness testimony, and other contemporary evidence. Only when multiple sources support one another do historians begin to reconstruct what may have happened. One recurring pattern appears in several documented investigations. A convent received regular visitors, perhaps a local priest, perhaps a steward managing monastery lands, perhaps a craftsman repairing buildings over many months. Frequent visits gradually created familiarity. Conversations became longer. Boundaries became less carefully observed. Whether these relationships remained innocent or crossed accepted rules depended entirely upon the individuals involved. Most never attracted official attention. A few eventually did. One bishop's report describes concerns about private conversations taking place beyond approved meeting areas. Another investigation mentions repeated visits that exceeded what church regulations considered appropriate. Elsewhere, officials recorded suspicions regarding exchanged messages whose contents unfortunately no longer survive. Each case differs. Each community faced its own circumstances. Many questions remain unanswered because medieval records are often incomplete. Sometimes only one side of the story survives. Sometimes entire collections of documents disappeared through fire, war, or simple neglect. Perhaps the most dramatic stories involve attempted departures from convent life itself. Popular imagination often pictures medieval convents as prisons from which desperate women constantly tried to escape. The historical reality appears much quieter. Most nuns remained throughout their lives. Many became deeply respected members of their communities. Yet scattered across medieval Europe are documented cases involving women who attempted to leave. Their reasons varied greatly. Some believed they had entered religious life too young to make such a permanent decision. Others claimed they had been pressured by powerful relatives. A few wished to marry. Some simply desired a different future. Leaving, however, was rarely simple. Religious vows carried enormous spiritual and legal importance. Without official permission, departure could lead to lengthy investigations involving both church and secular authorities. One famous medieval case describes a young woman from a noble family whose relatives insisted she remain inside a convent despite her repeated objections. Years later, legal petitions reveal a prolonged dispute involving family influence, church officials, and questions about whether her vows had truly been voluntary. Even today, historians continue debating the details because surviving evidence presents different perspectives. Another collection of records tells of women who quietly disappeared during the night. Sometimes they were later found living with relatives. Sometimes they sought protection elsewhere. Occasionally, they simply vanished from history, leaving only a brief note in an official register stating that a sister had departed without permission. The silence that follows such entries almost feels haunting. One line. One missing person. No further explanation. History often leaves us wondering. Equally fascinating are stories that became famous largely because people continued repeating them for generations. A single accusation copied into one monastery chronicle might later appear in another, then another. Eventually, rumor and fact became difficult to separate. Some medieval writers enjoyed dramatic storytelling just as much as modern readers enjoy mysterious documentaries. A shocking tale traveled farther than an ordinary one. For that reason, modern historians constantly compare sources, searching for evidence that supports or contradicts popular legends. Many famous scandals become smaller under careful examination. Others become surprisingly credible when independent records agree. This careful process reminds us that history is rarely black and white. It exists somewhere between certainty and mystery. Perhaps the greatest lesson from these preserved investigations is not that medieval convents were secretly filled with romance. Quite the opposite. The remarkable thing is how few confirmed cases appear when compared with the thousands of convents that existed across Europe for centuries. Most communities quietly continued their prayers, their work, their study, and their service to surrounding villages without attracting any unusual attention. But historians naturally remember the exceptional stories. Quiet decades rarely become famous. Unexpected investigations do. As another candle slowly burns lower beside the monastery window, imagine the countless letters that have disappeared forever, the conversations no one recorded, the lives forgotten by history, and the handful of documents that somehow survived long enough for us to read them today. They remind us that beneath every habit, every prayer book, and every stone corridor lived people who experienced the same complicated emotions that humans have always known. Yet as surprising as these stories may seem, church officials soon realized that personal relationships were not the only challenge facing certain convents. Something even more powerful had begun quietly shaping life behind monastery walls. Not love, not friendship, but wealth, influence, and politics. Because, as we will soon discover, but romance was only one problem. As the night grows quieter, allow the sound of the rain to become softer still. Candles burn lower than before, their gentle light casting long shadows across the worn stone floor. Most of the convent has fallen silent. The sisters have returned to their sleeping quarters, and only the occasional footsteps of the night watch disturb the stillness. It is in moments like these that history often becomes difficult to separate from rumor. For hundreds of years, stories have circulated about hidden pregnancies, secret births, and bobbies supposedly concealed within medieval convents. These tales appear in old chronicles, legal documents, local legends, and later books that often repeated earlier accounts without questioning them. But what really happened? To answer that question, we must move carefully. Modern historians approach these stories with great caution because medieval Europe was a world where rumors could travel much faster than facts. A single accusation could spread from one village to another, growing larger each time it was repeated. Sometimes those accusations proved true. Sometimes they were completely false. And sometimes the truth was buried somewhere in between. Imagine a quiet abbey in northern France during the late 13th century. The harvest has ended, and the surrounding villages are preparing for another long winter. One afternoon, the local bishop receives an unusual letter. The writer remains anonymous. The handwriting is hurried. The message is brief. It claims that something improper has occurred inside a nearby convent. No names are mentioned. No evidence is offered. Only suspicion. Should the bishop ignore it, or should he investigate? Church officials faced questions like this more often than many people realize. Their responsibility was not simply to punish wrongdoing, but also to protect the reputation of religious communities from false accusations. So an investigation begins. Several weeks later, the bishop and a small group of assistants arrive at the convent. The sisters gather quietly in the chapter house. Questions are asked one by one. Has anyone noticed unusual visitors? Has any sister behaved strangely? Have there been disagreements within the community? Has anyone recently left without permission? Servants are questioned. Workers are questioned. Even nearby villagers may be interviewed. These investigations could continue for days, sometimes weeks. The surviving records show remarkable attention to detail. Witnesses occasionally disagreed with one another. One person claimed to have seen something unusual. Another insisted nothing had happened at all. Human memory, as we know today, has never been perfect. What one person considered suspicious, another dismissed as ordinary. This made the bishop's task extraordinarily difficult. Among thousands of surviving church records, historians have discovered a small number describing pregnancies involving women connected to convents. Some cases involved nuns, others involved women living temporarily within convent grounds. Still others concerned servants, widows, or noblewomen staying under the protection of the monastery. Over the centuries, many of these very different situations became blended together until every story simply became known as a convent scandal. Reality was usually much more complicated. One investigation from medieval England describes church officials attempting to determine whether accusations against a particular convent had any factual basis. Witness after witness offered conflicting statements. Some repeated rumors they had heard from neighbors. Others admitted they had never personally seen anything. Several simply said they did not know. Modern historians reading these records often reach the same conclusion. Rumor alone was never enough. Evidence mattered. And evidence was not always easy to find. When church investigators did confirm serious violations of religious vows, punishments usually followed. Contrary to dramatic stories found in later novels, punishment was often administrative rather than theatrical. A nun might be removed from leadership. She could be transferred to another convent. Periods of prayer, isolation, or stricter supervision might be imposed. Sometimes entire communities underwent reform if discipline had become too relaxed. Church authorities generally preferred restoring order rather than creating public spectacle. After all, religious institutions depended heavily upon public trust. Open scandal damaged everyone involved. This explains why official records were usually careful and formal rather than sensational. Yet outside monastery walls, ordinary people told stories very differently. Imagine a traveler arriving at an inn after several days on the road. He mentions hearing that officials recently visited a nearby convent. Another traveler adds his own version. By the end of the evening, a simple inspection has transformed into a dramatic tale filled with secrets, hidden chambers, mysterious disappearances, and whispered accusations. The next morning, those stories travel to another village, then another. Each retelling becomes slightly more exciting, slightly more unbelievable. Long before newspapers or the internet existed, gossip traveled remarkably well. This helps explain why some medieval legends became far more famous than the original events themselves. There is another important reason these stories spread so widely. Throughout medieval Europe, religious institutions sometimes found themselves caught in political struggles. Kings argued with bishops. Local nobles argued with abbots. Different religious orders competed for influence. During periods of conflict, damaging the reputation of an opponent could become an effective political strategy. One way to weaken a wealthy convent was to question its moral reputation. A rumor required no army. An accusation cost nothing. Even if later proven false, suspicion often lingered. Historians call this a form of propaganda. Today, we usually associate propaganda with modern governments and newspapers. But medieval societies also understood the power of controlling public opinion. A carefully placed rumor could influence donations. It could affect local politics. It could weaken rivals. It could persuade powerful families to support one institution instead of another. This does not mean every accusation was invented. Far from it. Real misconduct certainly occurred in some places. Human beings have always been imperfect. But historians must constantly ask an important question. Who wrote this account? Why was it written? Who benefited from people believing it? Those questions are just as important as the story itself. Consider the monasteries dissolved centuries later during periods of religious reform. Officials searching for reasons to seize valuable church property sometimes emphasized reports of corruption. Whether every accusation reflected reality remains the subject of continuing historical debate. Some investigations uncovered genuine problems. Others appear suspiciously convenient. This is why modern scholarship spends so much time comparing documents from different sources. One record alone rarely tells the whole story. Several independent records agreeing with one another provide much stronger evidence. As the candle beside us burns lower, imagine shelves filled with fragile parchment. Thousands upon thousands of handwritten pages. Some describe ordinary harvests, some record donations of sheep or grain, others preserve legal agreements. And hidden among them are occasional investigations into lives forever changed by rumor, misunderstanding, poor decisions, or genuine misconduct. Every page reminds us that history is rarely simple. Real people lived these lives. Real communities struggled with difficult questions. Real investigators attempted to discover the truth using only the limited evidence available to them. Some succeeded. Others almost certainly reached the wrong conclusions. The farther we travel into medieval history, the more we realize that certainty becomes increasingly rare. The greatest mysteries are often not the scandals themselves. They are the stories that can never be fully proven one way or the other. Outside, the rain has finally stopped. The clouds slowly drift apart. Moonlight falls across the quiet courtyard, where everything once again appears peaceful. If someone walked past the convent at this very moment, they would see only silence. They would never guess how many whispered stories had become attached to these ancient walls over the centuries. Yet even these rumors, investigations, and personal tragedies were not the greatest force shaping the lives of many medieval convents. Love could create difficulties. Rumors could damage reputations. But both were often overshadowed by something far more powerful. The greatest danger wasn't love. It was politics. As the moon climbs higher above the monastery, the world outside grows almost perfectly still. The rain has stopped. A cool breeze moves gently through the gardens, carrying the scent of lavender, rosemary, and damp earth. Somewhere beyond the monastery walls, a horse quietly pulls a cart along an empty road. Its wooden wheels creak softly before disappearing into the distance. Inside the convent, every candle burns a little lower. The sisters have finished their evening prayers. Most have fallen asleep beneath rough wool blankets, unaware that while they dream, another story is slowly unfolding. A story not about romance or whispered rumors, but about something far more powerful: money, land, influence, and the quiet struggle for control. When many people imagine a medieval convent, they picture a small stone building surrounded by a modest vegetable garden. For some communities, that image was perfectly accurate, but others were something entirely different. Some convents became astonishingly wealthy. Centuries of generous donations transformed them into institutions that rivaled powerful noble families. Imagine standing on a hill overlooking one such convent. The stone walls stretch farther than expected. Beyond them lie vineyards heavy with grapes. Golden wheat fields ripple gently in the wind. Large sheep graze peacefully across rolling meadows. Watermills turn slowly beside nearby streams. Fruit orchards extend toward the horizon. Every one of those fields belongs to the convent. Not to a king, not to a knight, but to a religious community. It may seem surprising today, but throughout medieval Europe, land represented wealth far more than coins ever could. Land produced food. Land produced wool. Land produced timber. Land generated rent. Whoever controlled the land controlled much of the local economy. Many convents received these lands through donations. A wealthy nobleman approaching old age might donate several farms, believing that such generosity would bring spiritual blessings upon his family. A queen might gift forests or vineyards to honor the memory of a deceased child. A merchant who had survived a dangerous illness might leave part of his estate to the church out of gratitude. Every generation added something: a meadow, a mill, a village, another field, another forest. Over hundreds of years, these gifts accumulated until some convents possessed enormous estates. Managing such wealth required remarkable organization. The abbess was no longer responsible only for prayers and spiritual guidance. She also became, in many ways, the manager of an entire economic system. She supervised harvests. She approved repairs. She oversaw accounts. She negotiated contracts. She settled disputes between tenants. She corresponded with bishops, merchants, lawyers, and noble families. Many abbesses proved exceptionally capable leaders. Historical documents praise women who carefully protected monastery lands, improved farming methods, established hospitals, and provided food during years of famine. Without their leadership, some communities might never have survived difficult times. Yet great responsibility always attracts great attention. Local nobles watched these prosperous convents carefully. A wealthy monastery could influence trade throughout an entire region. Its decisions affected hundreds of farming families. Its grain reserves could feed villages during poor harvests. Its loans occasionally supported local rulers facing financial difficulties. The quiet convent had become an important political neighbor. Naturally, powerful families wished to maintain close relationships. Imagine a noble lord arriving with a large procession. His horses wait outside the gates while servants unload expensive gifts, perhaps fine cloth imported from Italy, perhaps silver candlesticks, perhaps valuable manuscripts copied by skilled scribes. Officially, these are acts of generosity, expressions of devotion. But medieval politics was rarely simple. A generous donor often hoped that goodwill would be remembered later. Perhaps the convent would support his family during a legal dispute. Perhaps an influential abbess would recommend his niece for an important religious position. Perhaps prayers for his ancestors would continue long after his death. Gifts carried both spiritual meaning and practical benefit. This delicate relationship between religion and politics shaped much of medieval society. Neither existed entirely separate from the other. As wealth increased, taxes and financial obligations became increasingly complicated. Contrary to popular belief, monasteries were not always completely free from taxation. Different kingdoms followed different laws. Sometimes kings demanded extraordinary payments during wartime. Sometimes local rulers challenged old privileges. Sometimes neighboring lords disputed property boundaries that had remained uncertain for generations. A disagreement over one small field might continue for decades. Parchment documents filled entire chests. Lawyers argued before church courts. Witnesses described events that had happened before they themselves were born. History became evidence. Memory became property. The convent that appeared peaceful from the outside could spend years defending its legal rights. Some disputes remained polite. Others became surprisingly bitter. One surviving medieval record tells of neighboring landowners arguing over grazing rights for sheep. Another concerns ownership of a watermill whose profits supported both nearby villages and the convent itself. Neither side wished to surrender such valuable resources. The arguments continued through several generations before finally reaching a settlement. Then there were donations. Nearly every gift arrived with hope. Some donors wished to express sincere gratitude. Others hoped monks and nuns would remember them in daily prayers. Many believed that supporting religious institutions strengthened both their community and their own spiritual future. Beautiful stained glass windows, stone chapels, libraries, hospitals, guest houses. Many existed because countless ordinary people contributed whatever they could. Not every donation came from wealthy nobles. A farmer might leave one sheep. A widow might offer a small piece of land. A baker might provide bread each week. Together, thousands of modest gifts built extraordinary institutions. Yet donations also created opportunities for dishonesty. Occasionally, church investigators discovered officials who exaggerated stories in order to encourage greater generosity. Here we arrive at one of the most fascinating and carefully debated subjects in medieval history: miracles. Throughout the Middle Ages, reports of miraculous healings, sacred relics, and extraordinary events attracted pilgrims from distant lands. Many reports reflected genuine religious belief. People sincerely believed they had witnessed something remarkable. Others hoped for healing, comfort, or hope. Modern historians generally avoid declaring whether miracles occurred. Instead, they ask different questions. Who recorded the event? When was it written? Were there independent witnesses? Did similar accounts appear elsewhere? In a few unfortunate cases, investigators concluded that certain miracle stories had been exaggerated or perhaps even invented to attract pilgrims. More pilgrims meant more donations. More donations meant greater prosperity. Again, these were exceptions rather than the rule. Most monasteries never faced such accusations. But where money gathered, temptation occasionally followed. Imagine a tiny village hearing that a nearby convent possessed a relic capable of healing illness. Within weeks, travelers begin arriving, soon dozens, then hundreds. Markets appear outside the gates. Merchants sell candles, bread, cloth, and souvenirs. Local inns become crowded. The surrounding economy flourishes. Whether every reported miracle was genuine mattered less to some people than the prosperity created by growing numbers of pilgrims. Church authorities understood this danger. When reports of miracles spread too quickly, bishops often launched careful investigations. Witnesses were interviewed. Medical conditions were examined as thoroughly as medieval knowledge allowed. Documents were compared. Some miracle claims received official recognition. Others quietly disappeared after investigators found insufficient evidence. Even 800 years ago, church leaders recognized that extraordinary claims required careful examination. As midnight approaches, our quiet journey through the convent reveals something unexpected. The greatest challenges facing many religious communities did not always come from within their walls. Often they came from the outside, from ambitious nobles, from competing landowners, from changing governments, from financial pressures. The convent had become more than a place of prayer. It had become a landowner, an employer, a political neighbor, a financial institution. And with every new responsibility came another opportunity for conflict. The stone walls still looked peaceful beneath the moonlight. The bells still rang every morning. The sisters still gathered for prayer. Yet hidden beneath that calm routine was an invisible web of contracts, taxes, donations, inheritances, and negotiations that quietly shaped the future of every community. As we continue deeper into our story, we will discover that the greatest threats to these ancient convents rarely arrived with swords or dramatic scandals. Instead, they often arrived carrying official letters, royal seals, and political ambitions. Because in medieval Europe, power could be far more dangerous than any whispered rumor. As the night grows deeper, the monastery becomes almost completely silent. The last candle in the chapel burns with a slow, golden light, its flame barely moving in the still air. Outside, clouds drift across the moon, covering the ancient buildings in gentle darkness. The gardens, which only hours ago were filled with birdsong and quiet footsteps, now rest beneath the soft whisper of the night wind. It is easy to imagine that every convent was a place of endless peace. For many sisters, it truly was. Most lived their entire lives without ever facing serious discipline. They followed their daily routine with devotion, caring for the sick, tending gardens, copying manuscripts, praying together, and growing old within the same stone walls. But medieval communities, like every human community throughout history, were not perfect. Disagreements happened. Rules were sometimes broken. Leaders occasionally made poor decisions. And when that happened, the church had its own system of discipline. Unlike the dramatic punishments often shown in modern films, discipline inside most medieval convents was usually intended to restore order rather than seek revenge. The goal was correction, not cruelty. Imagine that it is a quiet autumn morning. The convent bell rings before sunrise, just as it always has. The sisters gather in the chapel, their voices rising together in prayer. Everything appears normal, yet one sister notices that another is missing. The empty place remains untouched throughout the morning service. No one speaks. After prayers have ended, the abbess quietly asks a senior nun where the missing sister might be. The answer is brief. She has been placed in isolation. Isolation was one of the most common forms of discipline inside many religious communities. Today the word may sound frightening, but medieval isolation usually meant temporary separation from the rest of the convent. The sister might remain in a small room for several days or weeks, spending her time praying, reading scripture, reflecting upon her actions, and speaking only when necessary. The room itself was simple: cold stone walls, a narrow wooden bed, a small window allowing only a little daylight inside, perhaps a single candle, a prayer book, very little else. Meals were brought quietly to the door. Conversation remained limited. There were no visitors except those responsible for her spiritual care. For someone accustomed to living within a close religious community, the silence itself became part of the punishment. Human beings naturally seek companionship. Removing that companionship often encouraged reflection more effectively than physical hardship. Many medieval religious writers believed that solitude allowed a person to examine both their actions and their conscience. Whether that always happened is impossible for us to know, but that was certainly the intention. Sometimes the punishment became even simpler: bread and water. Modern audiences often imagine this phrase as something reserved only for prisons. In reality, temporary diets of plain bread and water were used within some monasteries and convents as acts of religious discipline. The purpose was not starvation. Rather, it was simplicity, a reminder to set aside comfort for a short period while reflecting upon one's responsibilities. Imagine the convent dining hall. Long wooden tables stretch beneath candlelight. Most sisters quietly receive bowls of vegetable stew, dark bread, perhaps a little cheese depending upon the season. One sister receives only bread. A cup of water rests beside it. No one mocks her. No one whispers. The room remains silent, yet everyone understands what has happened. The simplicity of the meal speaks louder than words. For medieval communities, food carried spiritual meaning as well as practical importance. Periods of fasting already formed part of religious life. Temporary restrictions therefore became a natural extension of existing traditions. Again, these punishments usually lasted only for limited periods. They were not intended to continue indefinitely. Another important form of discipline involved public confession within the community. To modern ears, this may sound uncomfortable. In many ways, it probably was. Imagine the sisters gathering after morning prayers inside the chapter house. The abbess sits quietly at the front of the room. One by one, community matters are discussed. If someone has violated an important rule, she may be asked to acknowledge her mistake before the others. There are no angry crowds, no shouting, no dramatic speeches, only quiet honesty. The purpose was not humiliation for its own sake. Instead, medieval religious communities believed that openly accepting responsibility could begin the process of reconciliation. Once acknowledged, forgiveness became possible. Many communities viewed confession not as the end of a person's reputation, but as the beginning of restoring trust. Of course, not every situation ended so peacefully. Some involved leadership itself. Imagine an abbess who has served faithfully for many years. She manages extensive lands. She oversees finances. She supervises dozens of sisters. People throughout the surrounding villages respect her judgment. Then questions begin to appear. Perhaps financial records no longer match. Perhaps complaints arrive from tenants. Perhaps several sisters privately express concern about her decisions. Church officials may decide that an investigation is necessary. If those concerns prove justified, one possible consequence is the loss of rank. Removal from office was among the most serious punishments available within many convents. The woman did not necessarily leave the community. She simply no longer held authority. Another sister would assume responsibility for leadership. Such decisions were rarely made quickly. Removing an abbess affected the entire convent. Church authorities therefore examined evidence carefully whenever possible. Not every accusation resulted in dismissal. Many investigations concluded that no wrongdoing had occurred. Others recommended small changes rather than complete removal. History reminds us that leadership has never been easy. Every decision pleased some people while disappointing others. Occasionally, however, the matter extended beyond the convent itself. A bishop received formal complaints. Witnesses were interviewed, letters collected, financial accounts examined. This was no longer simply an internal disagreement. It had become an official church investigation. Imagine the arrival of church representatives at the monastery gates. Their horses are tired from travel. Servants carry leather satchels filled with documents. The visitors are welcomed respectfully. Rooms are prepared. Then the work begins. Questions continue for days, perhaps even weeks. How was monastery money spent? Who approved important decisions? Were the religious rules being properly followed? Did anyone witness misconduct? The investigators wrote everything carefully. Every answer, every statement, every disagreement. Many of these handwritten records still survive today in archives across Europe. Reading them centuries later feels strangely familiar. Different handwriting covers each page. Some witnesses appear confident, others uncertain. Some remember events clearly. Others admit they cannot recall every detail. Human nature, it seems, has changed very little. What also becomes clear is that medieval investigators often struggled with exactly the same problem modern historians face. How do you discover the truth when different people remember the same event differently? Sometimes the answer remained uncertain. Sometimes evidence was incomplete. Sometimes justice was probably achieved. At other times, mistakes were almost certainly made. That uncertainty is one reason medieval history remains so fascinating. It reminds us that the past was filled with real people making difficult decisions using the limited information available to them. As the candlelight grows softer, imagine the convent returning to its familiar rhythm. Morning prayers resume. Gardens are tended. Books are copied. Meals are shared in silence. Life continues. The discipline, however difficult, was intended to protect the community rather than destroy it. Most sisters never experienced these punishments. Most lived quietly, faithfully, and peacefully. Yet the existence of these rules reveals something important. Even places devoted to prayer required laws. Even communities seeking peace needed justice. Even behind ancient stone walls, human beings remained wonderfully, and sometimes imperfectly, human. And as our journey moves toward its final chapters, we will discover that some of the most enduring stories surrounding medieval convents were not found in court records or official investigations at all. They were born from legends, ghost stories, and mysteries that still echo through these ancient halls today. The hour has grown late. The monastery is wrapped in silence once again, and the only sound that remains is the gentle whisper of the wind moving through the ancient stone arches. The candles have burned low, their tiny flames flickering as though they, too, are growing sleepy after centuries of watching over these quiet halls. Outside, a silver moon hangs above the abbey. Its pale light spills across empty courtyards, old graveyards, and narrow pathways that have been walked by countless generations. The world feels peaceful now, but for the people who lived during the Middle Ages, nighttime often carried a very different meaning. Darkness was mysterious. It was a place where imagination easily filled the spaces that knowledge could not yet explain. As we enter the final hours of our journey, we leave behind court records and legal investigations. Instead, we step into the world of legends. These are not proven historical events, they are stories, beliefs. Whispers passed from one generation to another. Some were written into medieval chronicles, others survived only through local tradition. Many changed every time they were retold. Yet together, they reveal something fascinating, not necessarily about ghosts or demons, but about the hopes and fears of medieval people themselves. Imagine standing alone in the cloister of an old abbey long after midnight. The rain has stopped. Mist drifts slowly across the gardens. Moonlight reflects from wet stone. The bell tower rises silently above you. Everything appears perfectly still then. Somewhere down a distant corridor, you think you hear footsteps, soft, slow, measured, one after another. When you turn to look, no one is there. Today, most of us would probably search for an ordinary explanation. Perhaps the sound echoed through the stone halls. Perhaps another traveler walked outside. Perhaps old wooden beams shifted as the night air cooled. But for many medieval people, such sounds could carry a far more mysterious meaning. Throughout Europe, stories developed about monasteries where the spirits of former monks or nuns were said to continue walking the halls after death. These tales appeared in local folklore for centuries. According to the legends, these figures rarely frightened people. Instead, they quietly wandered familiar paths, almost as though continuing the routines they had followed during life. Some stories described silent sisters carrying candles through empty corridors. Others spoke of distant chanting heard long after everyone had gone to bed. Modern historians do not treat these stories as factual evidence. Instead, they study them as examples of medieval folklore. Every society creates ghost stories. These legends often reveal more about the fears of the living than the fate of the dead. In many villages, people believed that anyone who died with unfinished duties might remain spiritually restless. Whether that belief reflected reality is impossible to know, but it certainly shaped medieval imagination. Another common legend involved haunted abbeys. Not every abandoned monastery earned such a reputation. Yet buildings damaged by war, plague, or natural disasters often became surrounded by mysterious tales. Imagine an old abbey standing empty after years of neglect. Its roof has partially collapsed. Rainwater collects inside broken halls. Vines climb over cracked stone walls. Birds nest where choirs once gathered. Wind passes through shattered windows, creating long, low sounds unlike anything heard in an ordinary house. To travelers passing after sunset, such places could feel unsettling. Without electricity, even familiar landscapes changed completely after dark. Every shadow appeared deeper. Every unexpected sound became more noticeable. It required very little imagination for stories to begin. A shepherd hears strange noises. A traveler reports seeing light inside abandoned ruins. Someone claims to have noticed a figure standing near the old chapel before it disappeared into the fog. Within a few years, the ruined abbey becomes known throughout the countryside as haunted. The story grows. Children repeat it. Visitors become curious. Each generation adds another detail. Eventually, no one remembers where the legend actually began. Many of these stories survived for hundreds of years. Even today, some medieval monasteries remain connected with local ghost traditions, despite the absence of historical evidence supporting supernatural claims. Historians view these legends as valuable pieces of cultural history rather than proof of paranormal events. Equally fascinating were the many superstitions that shaped daily life during the Middle Ages. To modern readers, some seem unusual, others surprisingly familiar. People believed certain days were luckier than others. Some carried small religious objects for protection. Others avoided traveling during particular weather conditions believed to bring misfortune. Owls calling at unusual times sometimes inspired concern. Unexpected eclipses frightened entire communities. Bright comets crossing the night sky often seemed like messages from heaven. Today we understand these natural events through astronomy and science. Medieval people interpreted them very differently. Without modern explanations, the universe itself appeared filled with hidden meaning. Convents and monasteries were not isolated from these beliefs. Although church leaders often discouraged excessive superstition, ordinary people sometimes blended official religious teaching with older local traditions that had existed long before Christianity reached their villages. This created a fascinating mixture of belief and folklore. A healing herb might be valued both because it possessed genuine medicinal qualities and because people believed it carried spiritual protection. A spring of clean water might be admired for practical reasons, while also becoming associated with miraculous stories. Faith and folklore often lived side by side. Perhaps no subject created more fear than accusations involving demons. Here, once again, careful historical understanding is important. Medieval Europeans genuinely believed that evil spiritual forces existed. This belief formed part of their religious worldview when unexplained illnesses occurred. When someone behaved strangely, when frightening dreams became unusually vivid. Some people interpreted these experiences through spiritual rather than medical understanding. Today, many situations once attributed to supernatural causes are explained through psychology, medicine, neurology, or other scientific fields. Historians therefore encourage us to understand these accusations within the context of medieval knowledge, rather than judging them according to modern medicine. Occasionally, convents themselves became connected to stories involving demonic activity. Perhaps unusual sounds echoed through ancient walls. Perhaps several sisters experienced disturbing dreams during the same difficult winter. Perhaps illness spread rapidly through the community. Without modern scientific explanations, fear sometimes encouraged supernatural interpretations. Church authorities generally approached such claims with more caution than popular legends often suggest. Many bishops instructed communities to focus upon prayer, patience, and careful investigation rather than immediately accepting dramatic rumors. Nevertheless, frightening stories proved memorable. They spread quickly. They changed with every retelling. A single unexplained event could eventually become a famous local legend. One medieval chronicle might briefly mention unusual disturbances. A century later, storytellers transformed that same event into a tale involving mysterious shadows, hidden curses, and supernatural visitors. The original account slowly disappeared beneath layers of imagination. This reminds us of something historians frequently encounter. People have always loved a good story. An ordinary explanation rarely survives as long as a mysterious one. As we sit quietly beside our imaginary candle, surrounded by the peaceful silence of this ancient abbey, it becomes easier to understand why these legends endured. The buildings themselves encouraged imagination. High stone ceilings, long empty corridors, ancient graveyards, echoing bells, cold winter fog, everything combined to create an atmosphere unlike ordinary village life. Even today, visitors often describe medieval monasteries as peaceful, beautiful, and slightly mysterious, not because they are truly haunted, but because they connect us with centuries of human history. Countless lives passed through these halls. Countless prayers echoed beneath these arches. Countless stories, both true and imagined, became part of their legacy. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all. History preserves facts. People preserve stories. Together, they become something far richer than either could ever be alone. As the first faint signs of dawn begin to appear beyond the eastern hills, our long journey through the hidden world of medieval convents is nearly complete. Only one final chapter remains, a chapter that asks perhaps the most important question of all. After separating rumor from evidence, legend from history, and myth from reality, what do these ancient stone walls truly teach us about the people who once called them home? As our journey through the quiet monasteries of medieval Europe slowly comes to an end, the first pale light of dawn begins to appear beyond the horizon. The stars grow dim. The candles have nearly burned away. The great stone walls that seemed mysterious beneath the moon now appear calm once again, touched by the soft light of a new morning. The bells have not yet rung. For a few peaceful moments, the entire abbey rests between night and day. It is here, in this quiet moment, that we can finally step back from the stories we have explored together. Over the past 2 hours, we have wandered through ancient corridors, listened to forgotten court records, examined old investigations, explored whispered legends, and followed the lives of women whose names have survived for centuries. Some of their stories were extraordinary, others were deeply ordinary. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson history has to offer. When people first hear about medieval convents, they often imagine only two extremes, either perfect places filled entirely with saintly devotion, or dark places overflowing with scandal and mystery. History rarely supports either picture. Instead, it presents something much more human: real communities, real people, real successes, real failures. Some convents became respected centers of education, medicine, and charity. Others struggled with poor leadership, political interference, financial pressure, or internal disagreements. Most simply lived quiet lives that never attracted the attention of chroniclers at all. This is something historians discover again and again. The quiet years rarely leave dramatic records. Imagine a convent where nothing unusual happens for 50 years. The sisters rise before dawn. They pray, they copy manuscripts, they grow vegetables, they care for the sick, they teach young girls to read. They prepare medicine from herbs gathered in the garden. They bury elderly sisters with dignity. Then life continues, day after day, year after year. Would anyone write an exciting chronicle about such ordinary peace? Probably not. Now imagine another convent where one investigation takes place. Perhaps a disagreement between leaders. Perhaps a legal dispute over land. Perhaps accusations that require a bishop's attention. Suddenly documents appear, letters survive, witnesses give testimony. Official reports are copied into church archives. Centuries later, historians discover these fascinating records. Naturally, modern readers become interested. After all, unusual events are memorable. This creates an important challenge. The historical record often preserves exceptional moments far better than ordinary ones. Because of that, it can sometimes seem as though scandal was everywhere. In reality, most convents left behind very little evidence precisely because daily life remained peaceful. Silence rarely becomes famous. Drama does. This is one reason modern historians approach sensational stories with such care. When an old chronicle describes shocking events, scholars immediately begin asking questions. Who wrote this account? When was it written? Was the writer actually present? Do other contemporary records support the same story? Was there a political reason to exaggerate? Could local rivalries have influenced the report? These questions matter because history is more than collecting stories. It is carefully weighing evidence. Imagine a large wooden table covered with hundreds of ancient documents. Some come from bishops, others from kings. Some were written by nuns themselves. Others by local officials, merchants, or travelers. No single document tells the whole story. Only by comparing them together does a clearer picture slowly emerge. Sometimes two records agree perfectly. Sometimes they completely contradict one another. That is where the work of historians truly begins. Rather than searching for simple answers, they patiently assemble thousands of small pieces into a much larger picture. In many ways, they resemble detectives investigating events that happened 7 or 8 centuries ago. One faded letter, one forgotten legal record, one damaged manuscript. Each offers another small clue. And often the conclusion is less dramatic than legend would suggest. This brings us back to the scandals that inspired tonight's journey. Yes, there were investigations. Yes, there were documented cases involving broken vows, financial disputes, leadership failures, and political conflicts. Those events were real, but they were not the whole story. Far more common were communities quietly caring for travelers, preparing medicines for the sick, preserving books that otherwise might have disappeared forever, teaching children, growing food during difficult harvests, offering shelter during times of war. Many of the greatest treasures of medieval learning survived because monks and nuns patiently copied manuscripts by hand over generations. Without their work, countless ancient texts might have vanished completely. Their libraries became bridges connecting the ancient world with the modern one. Likewise, convent gardens became centers of practical medicine. Long before hospitals as we know them today, many religious communities cared for the ill using knowledge gathered through centuries of observation. Herbs like sage, mint, fennel, lavender, rosemary, and chamomile were carefully cultivated not because they seemed mysterious, but because experience taught that they could sometimes ease suffering. Modern science has confirmed that some of these traditional remedies contained genuinely useful medicinal properties. History, once again, proves more interesting than myth. Even the legends we explored earlier deserve appreciation, not as evidence of ghosts or demons, but as windows into medieval imagination. Every civilization tells stories about the unknown, ghost stories, sacred legends, mysterious places. These tales remind us what people feared, what they hoped for, what they struggled to understand. In that sense, the legends themselves become valuable historical evidence, not evidence of supernatural events, but evidence of human belief. Perhaps that is why studying history is so rewarding. It teaches us facts, but it also teaches empathy. When we look at medieval people only through the lens of scandal, we miss their humanity. When we imagine them as perfect saints, we miss it as well. The truth lies somewhere between. They laughed, they worried, they became lonely, they celebrated, they argued, they forgave, they made mistakes, they searched for meaning. In other words, they were human, separated from us not by nature, but only by time. Now the eastern sky has begun to glow with the first colors of morning. Birds awaken among the trees surrounding the abbey. The monastery bell rings gently to welcome another day. The sisters slowly leave their sleeping quarters just as generations before them have done. Another ordinary day begins. Another chapter of history quietly unfolds. The stone walls remain standing. The gardens bloom once again. The echoes of old prayers linger softly beneath ancient arches. And somewhere within those peaceful halls, the stories we explored tonight continue to whisper, not demanding belief, but inviting curiosity. As you settle a little deeper beneath your blankets, allow your breathing to become slow and comfortable. Take one gentle breath in, and slowly breathe out. Let the quiet sounds of the monastery fade into the distance. The candles grow dim. The footsteps disappear. The bells become softer and softer until they are only distant echoes carried by the morning breeze. If these ancient stories have brought you a little peace, a little curiosity, or simply helped you relax after a long day, then I'm truly grateful that you chose to spend this time with me. If you enjoyed this peaceful journey through history, I'd love for you to subscribe and become part of our quiet little community here on Sleepy History. There are many more forgotten castles to explore, many more ancient kingdoms to visit, many more mysterious lives waiting patiently beneath the pages of history. Until then, thank you for letting me keep you company tonight. History is full of whispers carried through ancient stone walls. Some were true, some were exaggerated, and some may never be fully known. But for tonight, they are simply quiet stories to accompany your dreams. Thank you for joining me here on Sleepy History. Sleep well. And until our next journey, good night.